Well, good morning. Welcome to everyone here at the factory. I'm impressed that you're here and not trying to get that Christmas shopping done right away. If you're joining us from the fire hall or the warehouse, we're glad you're here. And for those of you listening in online or from Churchill, welcome. My name is Kirsten. I am one of the pastors here at Riverwood. And if you're new here, we're going through something called the story. The story is a narrative of the Bible. It takes biblical content and puts it in chronological order and helps us read it as if it's one continuing story. And we're in chapter 12 right now. This is not something we just do right here in the big service from the pulpit. Over 2,000 of these have gone into the homes of Riverwooders, and throughout the week we're trying to read the chapters so that we're all on the same page. If you're in a small group, there's a good chance your small group is also discussing what's going on. We've got the story for kids, so our elementary students are reading this with their families at home, and across the other side of that door there, they're teaching out the lesson from chapter 12 as well, and even our little ones have their own version, and they're doing this. In fact, in school gyms throughout the community, we also have our kids club, a drop-in program that is also teaching out the story, and so we have the synergy happening where the whole church is teaching on the same thing each week. Now, if you haven't read chapter 12, and you were bringing your kids maybe for the first time to Riverwood Kids, and we told you today we're teaching on David, if you knew parts of the Bible, that might be a really good thing, you'd think. Which story, you might wonder? The story of David and Goliath, the famous one where this kid takes on the giant and wins? Or maybe it's the story where David is anointed king, where God looks at all these tall and handsome and educated older brothers and chooses the runt of the family because he says he looks at the heart. Great story, right? Maybe it's a story about all the mighty men, David's mighty men in the Bible, this undertold story of superhero-like feats that these men who chose loyalty to David even before David was king happened. That's a great story. But if we told you, no, actually this week we're teaching about Bathsheba, you'd have a bit of a different response, wouldn't you? Her story may not be the most famous in the Bible, but it's remarkably well known. Infamous might be the better word for it. And if you haven't read this chapter in the story yet, it's a story of lust, illicit sex, cover-ups, and eventually murder. Bet you want to go read it now, don't you? Pick up your copy at the back. I mean, if I tell you we're teaching about David, there's lots to get excited about. But if I say the name Bathsheba, it gets a little awkward. My role here at Riverwood is to oversee the children's ministry. And so, truth be told, when I saw her name listed in what we were going through in the story, my immediate reaction was to pick up the story for kids. Please tell me we're not teaching about her with the kids, right? A king makes bad choices. Chapter 12 is listed. And it says this: David made a terrible mistake when he saw a woman named Bathsheba. She was married, but David wanted her to be his wife, so he had her husband go into battle where he was killed. Then David married Bathsheba. Well, it's a little awkward, but at least they've glossed over the R-rated part, so maybe we can teach that out with the elementary students. But surely the little ones aren't going to be going into this, right? I mean, they're preschool. How are we going to talk about an affair with preschoolers? David is sorry. David made a big mistake, and he said sorry. Yes. Perfect, I can teach that to a 3-year-old. See, we're pretty happy to talk about David, to celebrate David, to mention the heroic things he did, but Bathsheba is not really meant for polite company. I don't want her around my kids. I don't want her around my husband, truth be told. She's not really fit for polite company. I mean, isn't she the one that corrupted Israel's hero? Isn't she the one that seduced and entrapped David, this king, this man after God's own heart? Isn't she? Well, let's pull out the grown-up version and find out, shall we? 2 Samuel chapter 11, the story starts. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. Now she was purifying herself from her monthly uncleanness. Then she went back home. The woman conceived and sent word to David, saying, "I'm pregnant." There's a lot we know right here. We know that David isn't where he should be. He should have been out at war, but instead he's at home at the palace taking naps, it sounds like. He did something he shouldn't have. His friend Uriah's wife, he has her come to him, and they sleep together, and there were unforeseen consequences of a pregnancy. Well, maybe not that unforeseen. They are adults after all. But you know what we don't know? We don't know how it happened. There's no mention of seduction or wooing, or even if this is consensual at all. In fact, might it be possible that Bathsheba isn't the villain I've grown up knowing her to be? Is it possible that David isn't the innocent hero wrongfully lured into sin? Is it possible something else is going on? And maybe the bathing wasn't a seductive thing meant for him to see. Maybe it was an obedience thing. In accordance to the laws of Moses, she was purifying herself, hidden from everyone, except the palace roof far above the city where no one should have been right now. Maybe his calling for her wasn't something she had plotted out, but maybe it was something that terrified her. And the people in her life who were meant to protect her, her husband, her father, her grandfather, were all sent away to the battlefront, far from Jerusalem, not there when she needed them. So she goes alone to the palace, hoping against hope that her reputation as Uriah's wife will protect her. But instead, she finds herself with a lustful David, and her only choice is to defy the king or commit adultery, 2 acts both punishable by death. Could it be possible that all this time I've read it wrong, and Bathsheba might be the victim? Is it too out there to suggest that David might not be the hero I've always understood him to be? And the truth is, the Bible doesn't tell us. All it says is this: then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. And somewhere in that comma is an entire story. Is it a story of seduction, of entrapment? Or is it a story of 2 lonely people getting together and one thing leads to another and soon they've gone farther than they ever meant to? Or is it a story about the abuse of a king's power? We don't know. But I want to know. To be honest, the more I read this, the more outraged I get at this imagery of woman as property that's hinted at the story. And as I start listening to the other preachers preach on this and doing research on what happens, I want to cry foul at the number of people who have interpreted this to be a story about modesty or about avoiding loose women. I want to stand against this cultural interpretation that vilifies beauty in women and victimizes men. I want to call it like it is and say David just might be the monster in the story. I want to exonerate Bathsheba and let her name move from the dirty word to the Bible to a woman who should have been protected. I want to shout from the rooftops that God is not okay with the abuse of power. And I want this story to be one more that's added to the movement of #MeToo, named Times Person of the Year. These silence breakers who stand up and say, this is not okay. Because here we are, literally thousands of years later, hearing the same story. And I want to look at the Bible and say, this is that story. But what if it's not? Now, don't get me wrong. The Bible is very clear that God stands up for the powerlessness, that he has something to say against the abuse of power, that God is for the victims of injustice, and he is the one who gives a voice to those who have none. I am convinced that God is outraged against all abuses of power. And as a woman standing in the pulpit today, I also believe that God stands up for women, that the story of the Bible is the story of God reaching into a culture that devalued and dehumanized women, and he lifted them up, honoring them and restoring them to his Garden of Eden vision of male and female created in the image of God. But this might not be that story, because in this story, it's still just a comma. What may or may not have happened in that breath, I don't know. And I want to use my voice right now and lend it to the cause, but this is not about my cause. And if I'm completely honest, the Bible simply doesn't say. So maybe the real story here isn't what happened in the bedroom, but what happens afterwards. Maybe this is like the preface to the book. Before chapter 1 even begins, it gives you the context so you understand the rest of the story, but this isn't the story. The scandal isn't the story. The sin isn't the story. The real story, the meat of this, is God's restoration. Because in this story, the story that I struggle with isn't about Bathsheba, and it's not about David. It's not even about what happened in that comma. This is a story where God is the main character. And it's a story about how he comes looking for us in the middle of our mess to welcome us home. And for that story, focusing on who's the victim or who's the villain, it misses the point. The point is that the God of the universe comes looking for us in our mess, and he restores. And one thing we do know is that David was in a mess. He knew that sleeping with Bathsheba was a bad idea. Her husband was one of his mighty men, the men who had stayed loyal to him all those years, and likely a friend. Her grandfather was one of his closest advisors, but they were off at war, and maybe nobody had to know. She could go home, they'd call it a mistake, and they'd never see each other again, and no one would speak of it. Only she gets pregnant, and he panics, but he is the king. He can solve this. So he invites his buddy Uriah home from the battlefront and makes a feast for him. He's got a plan. He'll send him home to his wife, and who can resist that beauty? They'll get together, and when the baby comes, everyone will think it's Uriah's. Only Uriah won't go home. And in a statement that must have stung to hear, he tells David, "The ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my commander Joab and my Lord's men are camped in the open country. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and make love to my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing," he says to the man who's doing such a thing. Well, David doesn't give up, and he tries one more time. He gets Uriah very drunk, thinking that will make it work. But Uriah, even wasted, has the sense to surround himself with friends who hold him to his vows and keep him in public. There's no way he can pass this baby off as Uriah's. So David has to find another way to fix it. And as Uriah marches back to war, it seems so obvious. So many go to war, and so many don't come home. Who's going to know if Uriah is another one of them? Just another casualty of war. So he arranges it so that Uriah is sent to where the fighting is fiercest, and as planned, Uriah dies. And there's a mourning period where David holds his breath, wondering if anybody's going to call him out. But when the mourning period ends, and he's free to marry Bathsheba, he tells everyone it's a kindness to his friend Uriah that he's marrying his widow to look after her, to protect her, to make sure she's okay. And I wonder what their wedding ceremony was like. Was it one where they breathe a sigh of relief, thinking finally they're in the clear? Or is it one of terror, wondering if anybody's going to know? Is she terrified? Is she now marrying the monster who killed her husband? Or are they both breathing a sigh of relief? We don't know, but we do know this. At this point, David finally is in the clear. And as I read the story, there's a picture I can't get out of my head. I was visiting with my sister-in-law, and someone else had dropped their kids off as well. So we had 2 adults and about 8 kids running around the house. And I remember sitting there with my tea thinking, this is great. These kids are finally old enough to entertain each other. Our idea of babysitting means staying in the house and having a tea, and we were just having a grand old time. Now, some of you moms are laughing already because you know this isn't how it works with kids, right? Well, after a while, it occurs to us that maybe silence isn't the gift we've been expecting it to be, and maybe we should go check on all these kids. So we go looking for them, and some of them we find playing nicely and everything's going well, but the 3 youngest are missing. 2 of them aren't ours, so we're a little panicked. We're supposed to be watching them. So we start hunting for them, and they're not answering when we call, and they're not in the obvious places. So as the panic rises, we begin to look in the unlikely places, in the closets, under the bed, anywhere where they might be hiding, thinking this is a funny joke. Well, finally, I hear a voice. "I found them," she calls. They'd gone to the basement where they're not allowed. It's full of unpacked boxes, and we're not quite sure what kind of trouble they'll get into. But they had bypassed all those boxes and gone to the far corner, and there's a desk there, so they'd crouched and hidden under the desk. And then for good measure, they'd brought a blanket along and pulled that over their heads. And in that far corner of the basement, under the desk, under the blanket, there's 3 preschoolers and a bag of Halloween candy. And a whole lot of empty wrappers. And she lifts the blanket, and they are terrified because they are caught in the act. And I wonder if that's how David felt when Nathan walks into the room. Nathan shouldn't know. He's a friend of David's and a prophet of God, and as far as David knows, he has no idea what's going on. He's relaxing, and Nathan comes in and he says, God told me a little story. Want to hear it? And he tells David this story. There were 2 men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to them. Now a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come. Instead, he took a ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him. David burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, as surely as the Lord lives, this man who did this must die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over because he did such a thing and had no pity. And Nathan looks at him and says, you're that man. David, you are that man. The blankets are pulled off. God goes looking for David in the middle of his mess. And he lifts up the blanket, and there sits David, totally exposed. And this is a story we read again and again throughout the pages of the Bible of God coming looking for us when we're in the middle of our mess. Now, sometimes we find ourselves in the middle of a mess, and we're the victims. We got there accidentally. And in those times, I don't know about you, but I have no problem falling on God's mercy and grace. But when I made the mess, when I deliberately got somewhere that I shouldn't be, when I find myself there, part of me thinks I need to clean it up before I even go to God. That I don't want him to see me like this. I don't want him to know that I can be this bad. I want to hide. And I'm reminded of Adam and Eve in the garden after they had taken that forbidden fruit, and they're hiding from God. And God came looking for them. He pursued them. He didn't leave them to clean up the mess on their own. He went to them. What do you do when God lifts up that blanket and finds you in your mess? Well, there's dozens of ways, apparently. No matter the scope of the situation, we seem to always fall back on some of these same habits. We conceal it. We pull the blanket back down and pretend he's not even there. Or we blame. It was his idea. He made me do it. Adam and Eve did that, right? She made me do it. The serpent made me do it. It's not my fault. Sometimes we minimize. Oh, it's not what it looks like. It's not as bad as you think. Some of these wrappers were here before. I only had a couple. We scorekeep. He ate more than I did. I didn't have that much. Or we rationalize. Well, you never said we couldn't. We justify. It's my candy, after all. I would have eaten it eventually. But David doesn't do those things. And I wonder if this here is why David is called a man after God's own heart. Not because he was so pure and God had it all together. Not because he was a victim wrongly lured into sin. Not because of his own righteousness. No, I think David was called a man after God's own heart because he did none of these things. He doesn't hide. He doesn't justify. He doesn't demand it as his right as king. He never once blames Bathsheba or tried to pass the buck off to uncooperative Uriah. He doesn't rationalize his behavior. He doesn't whine, and he doesn't get defiant. Then David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. There's a word for this, and it's confession. It means to stop passing the blame, stop justifying, rationalizing. Confession means to accept full and complete responsibility. It's a powerful thing. It's a biblical word, but it's also a legal word, one used in our court system even today, and it comes with a lot of power. And David confesses. He accepts responsibility. I have sinned, he says. And in this story, in God's story, his apologies aren't to Bathsheba or all of the people who became implicated in this whole mess. He says he's sinned against God and God alone. Against you and you only have I sinned, David says. Well, Uriah might beg to differ had he still been alive. And if I'm completely honest, I want to step outside the preacher role for a minute and say, I don't really like this. I don't think that David should be forgiven, at least not completely. I think that there should be some caveats added to his name. I'd like God to restore him, but maybe not fully. Let's say, okay, David, we'll forgive you, but from here on in, you're going to be known as the man after my own heart, mostly. From here on in, we're going to put a caveat when we say your name. We want people to remember that you weren't as good of a guy as we like to think you are. I know I don't want him to be punished forever for this, but I also don't want him to be totally forgiven. It bugs me a little bit that when God restores, his restoration is complete. So thoroughly restored, in fact, that God points to him in the Bible and says, be like this man. And I want to say, yeah, but God doesn't put those qualifiers on. He doesn't do that. When he restores, he does it fully and completely. And David knows he doesn't deserve this. He knows that there's no way that he can even dare ask for anything. The humility he goes forward with says he knows how bad things are. Because the truth is, there is no price big enough that completely covers David's sin. He can't pay anything. He can't do anything to make this completely right. It's a price he can't afford. So it's a price that God pays for us. God doesn't make this cheap. He doesn't make restoration a simple and easy thing, a magic wand he waves. No, he knows there is a price to be paid, but God pays it for us. Jesus takes on the role of the criminal, dying on the cross, bearing our shame, the Bible says. Why? So he can restore us completely and fully. So God looks for David in his sin. Before David's even sorry about it, he's still pretty content in how he's covered everything up. And before David is sorry, God goes looking for him. And he lifts up that blanket and he says, are you ready to come home? He did the same for Saul once, actually. 2 chapters ago, we read about it. The sin was arguably lesser, a reinterpretation of sacrificial commands. And we find Saul on the battlefield. He's sacrificed something to God that Samuel was supposed to. And Samuel is sent to him in the same way Nathan was, this prophetic role, to lift up the blanket and say, Saul, what's going on? But instead of confession, Saul begins to rationalize. Oh, you weren't here, he says. I thought I'd go ahead and start without you. And Samuel asks, what's this bleating of sheep I hear in the background? And Saul justifies, I was just getting to that. I'm not done yet. I'm getting there. Instead of confession, Saul tries to conceal his sin. In his arrogance, he will not confess. He will not be exposed. And he ends up far from God, a disgraced and forgotten king. But David falls on God's mercy and is forever known as the man after God's own heart, Israel's greatest king. See, when we come to God with our arms wide open, no longer hiding, God lifts us out of our mess and restores. Oh, don't get me wrong, there's still consequences. For the rest of David's life, we're going to see them show up here and there because you can't erase what happened. But God restores our relationship with him. That is fixed. Listen to David's prayer. Psalm 51, he says, have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. According to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions. Wash away all my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. Create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. Do not cast me from your presence or take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation and grant me a willing spirit to sustain me. He knows it's not because of anything he's done, but it's only by the grace of God. And Psalm 32 verse 1 says, blessed is the one whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered. And you know what's interesting about this is that covering up is exactly what David's been trying to do in this whole story. He knew his sins need to be covered, and that's what he's trying to fix. All of this that's been going on has been for the purpose of covering up his sins. But it wasn't until he uncovered them, until he confessed, that the covering God gives came upon him. And when he stepped out of his hiding spot, faced God, uncovering his shame and falling on God's mercy, he found it. And he writes this song. When I kept silent, my bones wasted away. Through my groaning all day long, for day and night your hand was heavy on me. My strength was sapped in the heat of summer. Then I acknowledged my sin to you and did not cover up my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the guilt of my sin. You know, in Riverwood Kids, we call the Bible the big God story, because we get caught up in these characters, and Adam and Eve and Noah and all of these great characters in the Bible, and we start to think of them as the main character. But that's not the case. They're the supporting cast. God is the main character. And this whole Bible, it's all about God showing up in the lives of people. And so when you get to the last page of the Bible, the story doesn't actually end, because God is still writing it today. He is still looking into our lives and in our messes. He's looking for us. He's lifting up the blanket in our lives and saying, are you ready to come home? And do you know what restoration looks like? It looks like coming home. It's a story that's told throughout the pages of the Bible. In the story of the prodigal son, this young man that looks at his father and says, I wish you were dead. I wish I had my inheritance now. And the dad gives him his inheritance, and he goes and he blows it on wild living, everything his father stands against. And when his life is over and everything's gone and he realizes what he's done, he wants to crawl back home, not to be forgiven by his father, but maybe to get a place in his father's servants, to get a job. And as he stumbles home, rehearsing in his mind what he's going to say, his dad comes running towards him. His dad comes looking for him, and he embraces him, and he puts a robe on his shoulders and puts a ring on his finger, and he restores him not just to the household, but as the beloved son. And the stories keep coming. Luke 15, verses 4-7 is a story Jesus tells. He says, suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Doesn't he leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? And when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders and goes home. Then he calls his friends and neighbors together and says, rejoice with me, I have found my lost sheep. I tell you, in the same way, there will be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who do not need to repent. And I've always read that story imagining that's what happens when somebody for the first time asks God for forgiveness and is restored. And I think it's true, but I think it's more than that. I think this is also the story of the Davids, people who should have been following God for the last 2 decades and find themselves in a mess like this. They confess and repent. And when David did that, I believe there was rejoicing in heaven over his repentance. And the stories keep coming. We've got Peter who denies Jesus, and Jesus goes looking for him. Jesus seeks him out to restore him, not just as a friend of Jesus, but as a leader in the church. Zacchaeus, a Jew whom everybody else has turned their backs on because he is that bad. And Jesus goes looking for him to restore him to the family. Restoration. God looking for us and inviting us home. Restoration looks like family. It's December, so I'm reading through the Advent story right now at home, and it starts in Matthew chapter 1 with the genealogy of Jesus' family. Now, genealogies are never the most exciting part in the Bible. The story tends to skip them for a very good reason. Like reading someone's grocery list. Sure, you can find out something about the family, but who really does that? But genealogies, too, have a story. And we had a bit of fun with my own genealogy when a distant cousin of my dad's bothered to get really serious about it and started tracing the lineage back. Well, he got back far enough that he actually hit some French royalty. And once you hit royalty, it's easy because they're meticulous about genealogies. And so he found a huge record tracing back centuries, published a book about it, and mailed us a copy. Well, For a few years there, my dad would introduce himself to strangers as King Einar. Embarrassed my mom completely, which I think was the point. And us kids really thought it was great fun. Now, the book's in Norwegian, which only my father can read, so he might have made it all up. But unless they revive the French throne and a couple 100,000 people die, it's not going to make any difference in my life other than a neat party trick. But every now and again, we get a glimpse of the importance of genealogies. Maybe in the ads we see on TV where you can send in a bit of your DNA and they will tell you what direction to start looking when you want to trace your lineage. The software you can get that helps you trace it back because people want to know where they belong. And genealogies do that. They tell you where you belong. Now, I didn't grow up in southern Manitoba, so some of the nuances of the small towns here I miss completely. But a few years ago, my parents decided to make the move to Landmark. Now, Landmark apparently is a very close-knit Mennonite community, and my maiden name is Sandland. Nothing Mennonite about that at all. So a few well-meaning people took my parents aside and thought maybe they should reconsider because they said, you might have a bit of a hard time belonging here. It's a very tight-knit Mennonite community, and I'm a little worried that you won't fit in. Well, my mom's a Mennonite, so she just took this as a challenge. She dusted off her old Plet book, her genealogy book, and for the next year as they moved to Landmark, I kept hearing stories about, I met my first cousin, she's our next-door neighbor. The postmaster, he's a fourth cousin. I met this person, they're third cousins, and by the end of the year, I was pretty convinced we were related to the entire town. They love it in Landmark because they have found where they fit. This genealogy tells them that they belong, that despite our non-Mennonite last name and the Norwegian accent my father bears, they have a place there. They fit in. They're part of the family. And that's what genealogies can do. They tell us where we belong and how we fit. And so as I read Matthew 1, reading Jesus' genealogy, it starts like this. This is a record of the ancestors of Jesus the Messiah, a descendant of David and of Abraham. David belongs. David's in. He has been restored so fully, so completely, that he is listed in a place of honor in Jesus the Messiah's genealogy. Do you know who's not in this? Saul. Saul, who could never confess. Saul, who God went looking for, and he said, I'm good, I've got this. He doesn't make it in, but David, even though his sin was arguably greater, he is here in a place of honor. Because when God came looking for him, he said, here I am, help. We read on, Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob. These are some names we recognize from the story already. And there's more names in here that stand out as people we've met before in the 12 chapters we've read so far. Boaz, that great guy who helped widows on his farm. He's just such a nice guy. I'm kind of happy he's here, right? Rahab, that's a bit of a surprise. Women don't usually make their way into Hebrew genealogies, and she wasn't Israelite, and she was a prostitute. But here she is, with God saying she belongs, she's in, she's part of the family. David, the father of Solomon, whose mother was Bathsheba, the widow of Uriah. They're both there, David and Bathsheba. And I love that. We may have vilified Bathsheba, but God doesn't. We might wonder who is wrong and who is right in this story, but God doesn't. God took a broken and messy situation and he restored fully and completely. I might cringe at the idea of teaching out Bathsheba to the young ones, but God does not cringe. He puts an arm around Bathsheba, puts her name in Matthew chapter 1 and said, she's in, she's family, she belongs. You want to make fun of her? You're making fun of Jesus' grandma. Take that. David and Bathsheba, they're both in there. God restores. And the next time we see Bathsheba in the book of Samuel, it's a very different story. She's no longer a silent character, always called Uriah's wife, but she now has a name, Bathsheba. She stands in context of relationship as someone with a name, with a voice, and she plays a huge influence in determining the future of Israel as she and Nathan approach David. She's restored. She's family. So maybe the story for little ones isn't as far off as I might think, because the story really isn't about the scandal, is it? It's about the God who comes looking for us, who calls us to repentance. David is sorry, he calls it. Let me read to you from this book. King David did good things when he listened to God. But one day, David didn't listen to God and made a big mistake. He fell in love with another man's wife. A messenger named Nathan showed David his mistake, and David was sorry. He wrote a song to God, asking God to forgive him, and he did. God will forgive your mistakes if you tell him you're sorry. It's so simple, yet so profound, and potentially life-changing, because you see, God is looking for you. God lifts up the blanket and finds us in our mess. He sees us and says, "Are you ready to come home?" And all that's left is our response.